Wow, it seems like it's been a long, long time since we got together. The pandemic has been a hell of an experience for human civilization in general. For many of us, perhaps most of us, directly, immediately, and personally. And it's just wonderful that we're able to come together live and online at the same time now, after more than 2 years of this. Masks are not required inside buildings at this moment within the university. However, we in the history department know very well from recent experience that we may be very weary of the pandemic, but the pandemic is not weary of us. So feel free to wear the mask or take it off as you prefer, but beware, the virus is bent on evolutionary survival, and that is not favorable to us. Today, we are experimenting with a new format for the science of the human past, if not for the natural sciences and other areas, and that is lightning talks. The natural sciences have many good things to share with the humanists and social scientists, one of which I particularly appreciate is abstracts. You don't have to read the 90-page article to know what's in it. That's really, really helpful. Another good thing, I think, but you will judge now based on your own experience of this event, is what I first experienced at the Google Skunk Works some years ago when I was fortunate enough to be invited to Google X, to the Science Sci-Fu camp in Palo Alto or Mountain View or wherever the heck it is, someplace with guys in black clothes with short hair standing like this in all the stairways so we didn't wander off into the recesses of the big building that Google had put at our disposition. Wonder what was going on there. But anyhow, lightning talks are very cool. They're challenging for the speaker because they oblige you to condense into 5 minutes what is often a very complex investigation. But they're cool because they allow us a quick overview of many things. We have not been dormant during the pandemic. We of the science of the human past, many of the labs were closed for a long time. Then they were operating under very dire circumstances. I didn't set foot in Widener Library for well over a year, maybe 18 months, which is incredible. I had every reason to think I was dead under those circumstances. So it has been a challenging time, and nevertheless, the work has progressed, and we're really thrilled to be able to share that with you. The work of the scientists, of the investigators has progressed. The work of our educational mission in the science of the human past, of sharing and of developing knowledge about the human past through the discovery of tools of investigation in the natural sciences for questions raised by the humanities and social sciences has continued. And so, for example, during the reception, you'll have the opportunity to see in the reception area some of the posters that were the end result of the work of our undergraduates in this year's Science of the Human Past course taught last fall. So please take a look at them, and if the authors are around, we'd be very happy for you to be able to enjoy them. While I'm on the subject of undergraduates, I want to single out and embarrass the bejesus out of Lindsay Bolden, who has just been awarded a prestigious Beinecke Scholarship in the arts, the humanities, and the social sciences for graduate study. 16 of these are awarded nationwide, and one of them is right here with us. Yay, Lindsay. Now, while Professor Warrener, sitting in Germany where she can't kick me, thinks that she may have played some role in this, I want you to know that this is entirely due to Lindsay's work with the science of the human past over the last several years, doing amazing work in building a geodatabase of historical evidence on climate events that you'll be hearing more about in one of our talks. So the undergraduates are a big part of this. The graduates, our students, are a big part of it. Our postdocs are a big part of it. And you'll be hearing from all ranges of our discipline here this afternoon. Let me quickly review the format. We'll have 5-minute presentations by each of the speakers. Questions will be reserved for the period at the end of that. At the conclusion of the various 5-minute presentations, we have the special privilege of welcoming Margaret Andrews from the Department of Classics, a very accomplished archaeologist of ancient and late antique, early medieval Italy. So she's going to be shedding some light on what she's heard from the perspective of a critically informed and competent and very active field archaeologist, which is extremely important, really extremely important, to bring together very different perspectives on these things. So let me just run quickly through what you're about to hear. I hope that it'll be really a feast of very varied dishes that will come swift and sweet, one after another. We'll hear first, speaking of swift and sweet, we'll hear from Professor Christina Warner, Associate Professor of Anthropology in this university, Sally Starling Seaver, Associate Professor at the Radcliffe Institute, Group Leader at the Department of Archaeogenetics at the MHAAM Institute for the Science of Human History, and our treasured friend, colleague, collaborator, and long ago and far away, a graduate student in this operation in the very early days of the science of the human past. So we'll start off with a talk by Christina Warner with a topic that I can't resist: reviving ancient brews, genetically reconstructing Tibetan beers and Roman wines. Who could not love this? We'll move on to hear from my good friend Jason Ure, the Stephen Phillips Professor of Archaeology and Ethnology in this university, who will be taking us into the role of 20th century spycraft in the science of the human past, the second generation of declassified intelligence satellites and landscape archaeology. We'll follow with one of our wonderful, amazing undergraduates, who, again, I attribute all his success to his association with the science of the human past, with our usual modesty, Michael Isikoff, AB in mathematics at Harvard College and AM in statistics in the university, expected in 22. Michael, for his sins, did take the famous course on the science of the human past, has worked very closely with David Reich in his laboratory to come to some amazing results in terms of an article in Nature, not bad for an undergraduate. When did the Celts come to Britain? Ancient DNA answers. We'll move on to hear from my dear friend, colleague, and co-conspirator in the Department of History, Daniel Lord Smale. It's been a long time. Cut me some slack, guys. It's been a long time. Daniel Lord Smale, the Frank Baird Jr. Professor of History at Harvard University, and Gabriel Pizzorno, Preceptor in Digital History at Harvard University, on this amazing thing that they have invented and developed. They'll be answering the question, what is documentary archaeology? Creating big data from medieval Europe's material culture. We'll then move on to another one of our postdocs, Solène Troadec, who writes her first name Solène in the Breton fashion, in the Celtic fashion, not in the French legal fashion. Solène Troadec, who's postdoctoral fellow with the Max Planck Harvard Research Center for Archaeoscience of the Ancient Mediterranean, and she will be speaking to us on her specialty. Not her specialty, but one aspect of her specialty, anomalous burials, the archaeology of death in early medieval France. Solène's first year with us has been sponsored by the Lounsbury Foundation, which is a foundation which encourages Franco-American scientific collaboration. We'll then hear from a former student, long-standing friend, co-archaeologist in the trenches with me, postdoctoral fellow with the Historical Ice Core Project, funded by the Arcadia Fund of London, and assistant professor of public health at Long Island University, and research assistant professor, complicated titles here, at our partner institution for the Historical Ice Core Project, the Climate Change Institute, directed by my good friend Paul Majewski at the University of Maine in Orono. And Alex is going to be talking to us about 1,000 years ago, climate change and globalization, ? And we're going to conclude, last but by no means least, with David Reich, Professor of Genetics at the Harvard Medical School, Professor of Human Evolutionary Biology on this side of the river, as he is learning the easy way. All the money in the university goes to those on the other side of the river, but those of us on this side of the river get all the teaching. David is going to be speaking to us on south to north migration. Excuse me, let me rephrase that. South to north migration preceded the advent of intensive farming in the Maya region. And then we'll conclude with the presentation part with some reflections offered by Assistant Professor Margaret Andrews of the Classics Department on what she's heard and what we should think about it, and perhaps to get us kind of riled up for conversation and discussion. So with no further ado, let me turn the floor over to Tina Warner, who is joining us. Tina is on sabbatical. She's joining us from Germany, where she's working. She has 2 labs, one in Germany, one here. Her lab director is with us, as well as several of her interns there. Tina will join us now.
Thank you so much, Mike. Can someone enable my screen sharing? All right, are you able to see my screen? To be here today and to get to kick off these lightning talks. I'm gonna go quickly through my research. What have I been doing since the pandemic? I wanted to speak today about one really fun project that I've been working on, which is investigating ancient brews, genetically reconstructing Tibetan beers and Roman wines. So overall, one of my greatest interests is trying to understand cuisines in the past, how diets and cuisines emerged, changed, moved, how people innovated new foods. And in particular, I'm extremely interested in foods that humans partnered with bacteria to create. So these are the fermented foods, things like converting milk into cheese, grains into beer, and fruit into wine. And there's many different ways we can try to understand these processes in the past, the origin of these very familiar and iconic foods within our diet today. We can do ethnography to look at how people produce these foods today. We can turn to bioarchaeology. We can also look directly into the archaeological record and examine things like food residues, which I'm going to talk about today. But how do you go from the kind of decayed remains of foods that we find in things like pots and bowls and cups and reconstruct the types of foods that might have been in it? And in particular with fermented foods, how do you understand the microbial composition of those foods or beverages, which are really what impart the flavors and the diversity and the character of those foods? The way that my group approaches it is we take a metagenomics approach. We extract all of the DNA within these residues, and we then genetically analyze that and try to reconstruct the composition. So a lot of the work I'm going to show here today is by a PhD student of mine, Maxime Bory, who will be finishing up his PhD later this year. From that DNA, we can then begin to reconstruct the types of microbes that may have been involved in producing that fermented food and also the kinds of foods that they would have produced. And today I'm going to talk about 2 case studies that we're working on, one on Tibetan Chang, which is a type of barley beer, and the other on Roman wines. So the first one takes place, some work I've been doing up in the Himalayan mountains with Mark Aldendorfer. The Himalayan mountains, the site that I'm working at is right here. As you can see, it's actually located in a strategic mountain pass. It's one of the most accessible points by which you can cross the Himalayan mountains. And many trade goods crossed here in the past. And a particular time period I'm going to be focusing on is right before the formation of the Tibetan Empire. And a lot of goods are passing through here, including technologies like the making of beer and fermented foods. We had the fortune kind of through there was a seismic event, and part of this ridge collapsed, exposing some tombs that we were able to access using salvage archaeology. And inside we had this incredibly well-preserved tomb with many, many food offerings. I'll just show you a few here. The preservation was incredible. We had wooden bowls with intact rice grains inside. We had wooden plates with kind of dusty residues. We had cups. We had bamboo cups. We had a wide variety of metal ladles and bowls and different things. And most spectacularly, this very large copper cauldron that contained the residues that you see here. We wanted to investigate the cauldron and better understand what might have been inside of it. And using these techniques, we're able to identify barley. really well-preserved DNA from 2 different yeasts, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which is used in brewing, as well as Pichia, which is a yeast that's very particular for barley fermentation, as well as a variety of lactic acid bacteria, which are also involved in the production of beer and are what give different types of beers their distinctive flavors. This suite of microbes in combination with the barley that we found really is the calling card for Chang, which is a type of fermented barley beer produced on the Tibetan Plateau, starting in prehistory, although we don't know the exact origins of it, but it became a really important trade good during the Tibetan Empire. And so we just effectively found one of these Tibetan beers. What's amazing about this, though, is we can go beyond just saying we have beer. We can actually reconstruct the genome of these different microbes. And based on that, we can begin to look at how they compare genetically, phylogenetically, functionally to known fermentation microbes today. And we can say something about how humans have influenced and domesticated microbes to produce the fermented beverages that we enjoy today. Moving on to Roman wine, this is another collaboration I've been doing with a colleague named Tsiona Ben Sheldaya, and we've been investigating evidence of a winery at the Herodium in Israel. The Herodium was a fortress that was built by King Herod of Judea. And during excavations, it was found that in this part of the fortress, you can see with the arrows, there was a kind of a winery or wine storage area between the 2 outer walls. Taking a closer look at it, a large number, about 20 different large dolia or very large wine containers were identified. These are huge wine containers. This is Tsiona here for scale. And so these would have been King Herod's wine stores. And at the bottom of these vessels, we have a kind of a grape mash or pomace, and inside are embedded things like grape seeds. And so we wanted to investigate if we could say something more about the flavor, the composition, the nature of these different wines. We obviously, as I mentioned before, we found grape seeds. So we know this was used to make grape wine. However, we actually found very little grape DNA. We found that these, in part because they've been collapsed in prehistory during the formation of the site after its abandonment, there had been some decomposition. So a lot of the DNA wasn't as well preserved as it had been in the Himalayan mountains, but even still, we were able to recover some fermentation bacteria, including Bacillus plantarum and Lentil Bacillus hilgardii. These are really interesting. So Lactobacillus plantarum, or Lactobacillus has been renamed, is a really important bacteria that's involved in winemaking. It's often responsible for malolactic fermentation, which is the process by which malic acid, which is quite acidic, is converted into lactic acid, which makes the wine milder and have a better taste. It also produces as a byproduct diacetyl, which is what gives some wines their kind of buttery flavor. So Chardonnays actually undergo this malolactic fermentation and have this kind of buttery flavor you might be familiar with. But what was also really interesting for us is the Lentilactobacillus bacteria is also well known, but in a bad way. It's quite infamous. It is one of the main bacteria responsible for wine spoilage. It's a major producer of toxic biogenic amines such as histamine, putrescine, and it is responsible for creating off flavors and also ill effects in those who drink wine that has been fermented in part by Lentilactobacillus hilgardii. So taking that into kind of account, it gives us some ideas about what the nature of the wine may have been. We're starting to get some clues. At the time of King Herod, it might not have tasted as good as one would hope. But these are just some early insights we have into reconstructing ancient beers and ancient wines using metagenomic techniques. And I'd like to thank all my collaborators and for your attention.
Good afternoon. It's really nice to be back, and I have to say I had forgotten how much I had missed the famous Mike McCormick introductions. I mean, they're a sight to behold. I'm kind of exhausted. I'd like to tell you something about what I've been doing over this break, and that is looking at spy satellite imagery. We've gone from the micro level of investigation with Professor Warner's talk, and now let's go to the macro, in fact, the regional scale. There are a lot of questions that you can't excavate. You can't put inside. You can't put inside a machine. You have to experience things at a very large scale, and that's where my career as a landscape archaeologist has really been powered by remote sensing, and particularly historical remote sensing from the early 20th century. The recent publication I'm showing you here was done with my former student, current professor at the University of Pennsylvania, Emily Hammer, and current grad student in archaeology, Mac Fitzpatrick. This is first view in antiquity right now. You're going to see a lot of QR codes in my presentation here. If you don't get one and you want to come back to it, you'll get to be able to see it at the end. But the gist of our piece here is, after the declassification of the first generation Corona spy satellite imagery in 1998, there was a huge expansion of really powerful landscape archaeology research because of this new data set. Well, as of about 6 or 7 years ago, the second generation, called Hexagon, which succeeded it, running from 1971 to 1987, this was declassified and showed up in the National Archives. And it is absolutely an amazing extension of what we've seen with Corona. And it is poised to yet further revolutionize how we ask questions about past landscapes. So this is a Cold War data set, so it will come as no surprise that the former Soviet Union is very intensively covered by this data set, as is Korea and China. And this is an early 1970s data set, so Vietnam is also very well covered. For my purposes, the Middle East is really well covered. We were very concerned about Suez, so Egypt and the Middle East, very well covered. Unlike Corona, South and North America were imaged. Obviously, Cuba, a place of interest, but interestingly, we were spying on ourselves. I feel like we all suspect that we're being spied on. Yes, we're being spied on. Lots in New Mexico, because that's where they were testing the resolution of these cameras, but I don't know if us lefties up here in the Northeast were held up for particular attention. Yeah, these are all these web maps that you're seeing here. You can access these via these QR codes if you want to interact with these web maps and scenes yourself. So the resolution of this imagery is really spectacular. On the left, you can see a Corona image. The spotter middle image is called KH7. And on the right, this is one of these new hexagon scenes. And I think I went too fast here through to see, this is the ziggurat at the city of Ur. No relation. You replay this, and there you can see that's the famous temple. And as you zoom in, you'll see that you can even see the stairs there in the front of it. So very, very high resolution. So how does this revolutionize things? Well, in some ways, it's a kind of a very small increase over what we've had before. You're looking here at an ancient trackway under the fields, and the resolution is so good that you can see the furrows here. There's that ancient trackway leading to this ancient city right here. But actually what I'm finding is it's the built environment, and in some cases the topography, that show up much better. I have to say that, having spent a lot of time looking at ancient trackways this is from the 3rd millennium BC in northern Mesopotamia, I already knew about this feature. Now I can tell that it got plowed up. But I mean, that's kind of cool, but it doesn't really tell me anything that I didn't already know. So the data addition is kind of incremental. However, let's look at a different kind of landscape. We're going from cities now to pastoral nomads. So this is northwestern Iran, and you're looking at a Corona scene and a hexagon scene, and then this is today. Here's a case where my earlier studies using Corona left some things a little ambiguous. So if you were going to zoom in on this very large feature, you'll see right there, it's pretty unambiguous in the Corona. It's very clear to be a series of pits in the hexagon, and it's now gone. It's been plowed away. It no longer exists. However, if you go to a different one, here's where the improvement comes. That was ambiguous to me on Corona. It is not ambiguous on the hexagon. It's clear that this is yet another campsite. And here on the right, you see what's become of these 1970s pastoral nomads. They've been settled by the government of Iran in their winter pasture land. So these are almost certainly the descendants of the people that moved to and from these campsites from the the early 70s. So in this case, it's going to be these very ephemeral landscapes, very small scale, detailed landscapes like pastoral nomadic campsites or the villages of the marsh Arabs. That's where these hexagon scenes are really going to revolutionize the way we look at past landscapes. Okay. So I showed you a link at the beginning to the published version in the journal Antiquity. But throughout, I've been leading you to the figures of that feature, and in a way that allows you to interact with them. I feel that the days of static maps in print publications is long past. There's no reason why we have to give you something that's flat when you can be interacting with, say, these maps and these images that I've shown you. The internet allows this. The internet also allows us to distribute our work to the people who fund it, which in my case is the US taxpayers, and the people whose cultural heritage I am studying. And this is largely the people of Iraq, Syria, other parts of the Middle East. When we put our publications behind a paywall, the taxpayers who funded our research can't see it, nor can the people whose cultural heritage we're seeing study this. So I am increasingly moving towards open access. In fact, it's now exclusively how I publish, not always through gold, sometimes through what's called green open access, which is where the entire content of my article is visible, but not the publisher's formatting. So the people of Antiquity did a great job on this article, but it can't be seen by my colleagues in the Middle East. So if you hit this QR code, it will take you to an ArcGIS story map, which contains the entire content of this article that can be seen by you, and links to all of those interactive figures if you'd like to play with them some more. So I am pledging myself to make sure that my results are available in this way to everyone, all of you. And I hope all of you will keep me accountable. And I would say, keep all of your other speakers accountable for this as well. We really need to make this transition in how we publish our results. Thank you.
I got the link up to everyone.
Hi everyone, I'm Michael, and it is not up here. Okay. Yeah, and I'm not going to be talking about any classified information today, but you'll have to do. But I am going to be talking about Celtic languages, and in particular, the entire role played by ancient DNA in that story. So the Celtic languages are a subfamily of Indo-European. And yeah. They include languages including Irish and Welsh today. Yeah, and importantly, they're spoken widely in Western Europe around 400 CE. BCE, excuse me, but in terms of the exact origin, it's largely unclear in terms of both space and time. So there are a couple of, what? Oh, I'm sorry about that. Yeah, there are a couple of theories. So in particular, I think the main theory is that it originates in Central Europe, at which point it spread into Eastern Iberia, and after that into Britain. Yeah, and I think the other main contender is that it originates in Iberia and spreads east after that point. And yeah, I mean, an important tool that we're going to need in order to interrogate this question is going to be ancient DNA. So in the human genome, there are a few million places that are known to vary, called SNPs. So an example of that would be a C and a G on the top individual over here, and then an A and a T in the same spot on the bottom individual. And yeah, at least on a high level, the idea is that if we compare typical genomes over space and time, there'll be a sense of the kind of population movements that are occurring over time. So an example of that would be if you have a large population, and at a certain time you have about 70% of the population has a certain allele A. And if we observe the same population 100 years later, and only a third of it does, it's extremely unlikely that would be only by chance, because it's only 5 generations. They're assumed to be approximately constant over time. So essentially, that would be an example of evidence of a large population movement in those 100 years. So essentially, the idea that we're going to use is we're going to use this ancient DNA in order to see if there are any migrations into Britain around this time in order to understand Celtic languages. And indeed, as I may have hinted, there is a migration to Britain around 1200 BC. So on the plot over here, I know it's a little bit hard to see, but if you look at the red, essentially that's showing a particular component of the population over time. And we see a big discontinuity around 1000 BC, around 1200 BC on this plot. And importantly, that's occurring in England. And if we look at the blue, so that's plotting Scotland, which I would think of as northern England during this time. There are no like actual regions around this time. And we don't observe the same shift at this time. And yeah, I mean, at first it's kind of strange, like, yeah, it's not entirely clear if there shouldn't be a signal there. But if you're thinking of people who are coming in from the south, in terms of the continent, yeah, I mean, it's possible that they're not reaching that area over time. And importantly, in terms of the actual evidence of a migration, it's not entirely genetic. So if you take a look at the people who are genetic outliers in a certain period of time, if you sequence the isotopes in their teeth, that will give you a sense of a lot of the places that they encountered as kids until around age 12. So essentially, if you do that, what you find is you have exact individuals who are of non-island origin. So that would be examples of people who are the actual migrants onto the island during this time. And importantly, in terms of actually understanding the shift, yeah, it's not kind of nebulous in terms of there is a shift. There is an actual way to locate where they're coming from. And the idea is if you observe a shift in the genetic frequencies, if you try to explain that shift via a few populations around the same time in the same place, that will be a sense of the kind of migrants who are coming in to the island. And indeed, if you do this analysis, what you find on the plot over here, what you find is a lot of the populations who are the best proxy for the shift are around France. And it varies slightly by population, but it's essentially the story is the same in the sense that about half of the ancestry is occurring from the migrants. And importantly, I've talked a lot about Britain and like implications in terms of Celtic languages, but it is actually a part of a broader story in Europe. So in particular, if you do the same kind of analysis across Europe, so we have a bunch of populations, so you have like Czech and Spanish and so on, what you find is that a lot of the populations are becoming more similar. And essentially the way I would interpret that is not as a particular horde of people coming in and like changing all of Europe. It's actually a lot of like small events that are potentially related, but it's changing the entire makeup of Europe in terms of culture and linguistics. Thank you.
Wow, that was great. Thank you, Michael. I wanted to thank Claire and Lisa for arranging everything. What you guys do is just amazing. And Mike, thanks for putting us all together here. Great. So last year, literally in the middle of the pandemic, just before the vaccine started coming out, so my colleagues and I, and this would be Gabe Pizzorno and Laura Moriali, Laura, you want to stick your hand up, published the documentary Archaeology of Late Medieval Europe. So this is a collection of estate inventories from later medieval Europe. Where's the advance here? Great. So a collection of estate inventories from later medieval Europe. And these estate inventories are really amazing sources for trying to understand the material culture of the human past. And they make it possible what we call a documentary archaeology. So what is a documentary archaeology? It is an approach to the material profile, the material culture of the human past that leverages the vast amount of information that is available in the form of words. So in the same way, you know, that our amazing colleagues in the SoHP, Mike and colleagues have been working on understanding pandemics and climate by putting text and science together in the same frame, we're putting text and archaeology together in the same frame to try to create, you know, a different, a new, a hybrid approach to the human past. So DALMI is the nerve center of an international collaboration with several research teams across Europe. We have about 100 collaborators of one kind or another. Most of the records, just to give you a sense of what they look like, consist of original images of archival documents with transcriptions, completely machine-readable transcriptions there on the right. And working with our collaborators, we've published close to 500 records so far in 12 different languages. This map gives you a sense of some of the places where we've been collecting materials from, and more are being added every month. So the data set, we actually have no idea right now how big it is, but it may be 40,000 line items. There's probably 500,000 words in the data set. And since everything is machine readable, it's available for really interesting linguistic and computational approaches. So the fundamental point is now, after a year and a bit since it's been online, the machine is running really smoothly. And the next frontier is to actually turn to the analysis, which is where I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Gabe.
Thank you, Dan. So I'm going to walk you very quickly over our general workflow. We take the original documents, transcribe them, we annotate them, and we keep that store as TI, an open standard that we use to store the information and also share it with other researchers. And then we translate the information we extract about objects and attributes into some sort of universal ontology that we can use to compare those objects and attributes. This is just an example that I like in particular because it's very varied. These are all references to the color that in English we call blood red. In our records, it appears in all these variants. In addition, if you were an archaeologist in the field and you encountered this color, you may measure it using a Mansell chip, and it would be 5R316. And if you were a museum curator, you may use Pantone 200C. How do you compare all these things if you wanted to do a search and retrieve everything that has that color or a certain shape or a certain type of object? Well, we connect the information we extract to ontologies, usually standards. For example, for a color, we would use the Getty Art and Architecture Thesaurus. And that basically assigns that ID all the way at the top 300310722 to that color, blood red. Every unique variation, linguistic variation of that color, for example, blood red, or I can't read any of those, so I'm going to say blood rot in Dutch at the end, or sanguineus or blodeus, the ones we use, are all connected to the one single code. That enables us to do a search for any of those terms, for example, and retrieve every occurrence of that, regardless of what language it was written in or in what context it was mentioned. In order to do that, we need to basically, to extract that information, we need to basically teach the machine to read the inventories for us. This is what we've been working on during the pandemic. That requires lemmatizing, basically tracing every one of those words to its root word, then determining what role that word is playing in the sentence, part of speech information, and then the connections between those words. That enables the computer to effectively understand what the sentence is saying. And this is something that is easy to do today. with pre-trained models if you're working in languages like English or Italian. It's not easy to do if, like us, you're working, in the case of this example, with a Occitan-inflected medieval Latin version from Marseille. So for that, what we had to do is train a specific model. The normal ways of training it, the results for the 4 more common Latin models are here, are not enough for what we want to do. We need the kind of results that the blue column shows. The only way we found to do that is basically slightly by hand. We classify the entire corpus, separated into groups of 200 sentences that we call seeds, and then manually annotated the first seed and trained a model specifically designed to learn from very little data. Then we used that model to parse the second seed. With that model, we annotated with fixed the annotations of the model. We used that to parse the third seed and so on. It took us 10 seeds that to get basically to over 95% accuracy for that model across the board, all the metrics. This chart shows how the blue is how good the model progressively gets. The yellow or orange is basically the time that it takes me to fix the annotations that the previous model makes. And as you can see, I'm quicker and quicker as the model becomes better and better, meaning it takes a lot less to annotate it. And before a big hook pulls me in, that's basically what enables us to go to the next step, to classify all those words and connect them to the relationships and to the generic concepts, universal concepts that enable the interface to really compare all those different objects. Please visit our website if you want to learn more about the project. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's really, really lovely to be here and to hear about all of this wonderful research going on and very, very different things. So I'm here today to talk to you about my search for anomalous burials in the early medieval France. So we are looking at the entirety of the modern French territory and the period early medieval. So for those of you not familiar with that term, it's 400 to 1000 CE in France. This project is also in collaboration with French researchers and especially the INRAP, which is our main archaeology institution in France. So most of the images you're going to see are from them. Before talking about anomalous burials, I wanted to make a quick note of what a normal burial is for the early medieval people. So this is very, very general, but most of the time you will have a grave that's in a burial ground or a cemetery, the difference being the presence of a religious structure in the middle. And the individual will be buried on his own in a single burial, so one grave, one person. Lying on their back with the legs extended, the arm position can vary widely, and with the head to the west. That being said, we actually have huge amounts of variations depending on the region we're looking at, and sometimes even depending on the community we're looking at. So in some regions, you will have bigger gravewood assemblages. On the screen here, you have a few objects that have been discovered in Vic. So this is in the north of France. And so you have a bell buckle with garnet, you have some very nice brooches, you have some pearls that were part of a necklace. In other regions, you have nothing at all in the graves. There's just like the body and nothing else that we can see archaeologically. Could have been some grave goods in organic material, but unfortunately we can't always tell if they were here or not. We also have a lot of variation in the type of graves. So the type of grave is how the internal space of the burial is organized. You can have a container, it can be made of stone, it can be made of wood, or you can have nothing at all. And that will depend again on the region you are working in, and also on the time period, on the precise moment this individual was buried. Because throughout the early Middle Ages, we have a lot of changes happening in burial practices. And we're very, very far away from this old concept of, the Dark Ages and nothing happened after the Roman period until the later Middle Ages. This is completely wrong. A lot of things happened, and some of them are the emergence of new elites. There has been new social structures, new social dynamics, and of course, the increasing influence of the church on the treatment of the dead. So if we have all of this variety, how do we actually find anomalous burials, and what criteria can we use to find them in the field? We need to look at everything the grave can tell us, and we start by looking at where it is. So there is a big part of landscape archaeology in finding strange burials. So most of the time, a strange grave could be something that is away from the main burial ground, so the individual is not included within the communal cemetery. We can have graves with more than one individual deposited simultaneously, and I really insist on the simultaneity of the deposition, because in France, in the early Middle Ages, you will have a lot of times graves that are being reopened to add a new individual. So they're only really anomalous if they've been put together. How do we know they've been put together at the same time? Well, we use a discipline that's called Archaeothermatology that has been theorized by Henri Dudet in the 1990s, which looks at the movement of the bone in the area of decomposition. And we can see if one body influenced the other, and so we can reconstruct the decompositional space and the sequence in which it happened. So if the bodies are in contact and they're touching each other, we can start to reconstruct and determine if they were buried at the same time or if the grave was reopened. Anomalous burials can also be in unusual structures or the body placed in a strange position. Once again, an example from northern France. So this individual was buried in a fetal position, very different from what you can see on the other slide, where the body is normally resting on its back. And we can also have strange grave goods, or just simply the presence of a grave good in a region where we don't have anything. There has been research recently in Brittany in a cemetery where there is a pot that has been discovered in a grave, and that doesn't sound exciting to you, but it is extremely exciting because we don't have anything for grave goods for the early Middle Ages in Brittany. So why is that here? I can't tell you, but I hope we'll find out. So why are we looking at these graves, and actually what can we tell already? We can't really tell much currently. And that's why they're so interesting as well, because they are definitely showing us a specific relationship between the communities and these special individuals. They decided to bury them in that way, and there must be a reason. Is it a social reason? Is it because they rejected these individuals? Is it simply because there were different burial practice like we have today? I mean, even if you go to a cemetery today, you will look around and you will see grave of all shapes and form. So why not in the past? And now, thanks to the science of the human past, we can go even further and actually look at biological relatedness between these individuals. So are they part of the same group? Are they part of the same family? Michael earlier was talking about movement of population and migration. And we can also detect their cause of death when it did not leave any traces on the skeleton, and try to understand, oh, are these individuals treated differently because they died of a specific disease? Or again, is it just that they're just different because we're all different? So if we're all different in life, why can't we all be different in death as well? Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Claire and Lisa, for organizing this, and Mike for your support for so many years. And thank you all for joining us. Thanks I think two students, Lindsay Bolden and Sarah Charles from the MAPS and Arcadia project, Climate Geodatabase. They're two veteran contributors. I'm sorry if I'm missing anyone else who is hiding behind a mask. But I did spy the two of you. Congratulations, Lindsay. So this project, this particular article is somewhat related to the work that we've been doing in the Climate Geodatabase project, which briefly is the largest geodatabase of historical testimonies of climate and environmental change for the last 2 millennia. It's approaching 50,000 records. And Lindsay's been one of the, and also Sophia have been two of the major contributors to it. And it's funded by the Arcadia Fund. This is slightly tangential and actually just published in one volume and about to be published in another. It came out of a conference at La Fondation de Treilles in France, where Mike generously sent me in August of 2019. And it was inspired by our common work with Professor Valerie Hansen at Yale, one of those rare Harvard-Yale collaborations. Not so rare, actually. And the book that Professor Hansen was presenting there, and her article, her talk, was about globalization before the Columbian Exchange, and we discussed at length what might have caused multiple civilizations to reach beyond their borders around this period. And we reached for climate because Professor Hansen kept finding references to it. I kept working on it. And we started with China, which was completely unknown to me as far as a Western historian goes. And we matched the historical records with natural records too in this particular slide, which show both dust and drought indices. And we saw that right before the year 1000, there was significant wet weather and then a precipitous decline right after, with an increase in dust, as would be expected. When you have more drought, you have more dust. And beyond. So I would just, note this drop here, right here, and just keep it in mind for a second. We then went back to Europe and looked at the same period, and that drop actually occurs 35 years later. And so, as we were discussing these this period and the whys of people and why they move and reach beyond, many historians disagreed. No, there was no period of warmer weather or drier weather in between 800 and 1000. This is not universal, it's not global. And the finding that the first and most important thing that we really found is that we are projecting our perception of climate change from today back in time. There is no such thing as climate change that is global everywhere all the time. And even today, it all depends on atmospheric circulation. So when we say 1 degree is, the Earth will warm by 1 degree by 2080, we actually mean an average of an average of an average, an average of all regions over time, over the entire globe. But it doesn't mean that all regions will warm by 1 degree. They will warm at different rates in different regions due to their location, atmospheric circulation. So the misunderstandings that we were and disagreements that we were dealing with were actually due to the fact that we were projecting our present moment, where things are much more global because the warming is perceived by everyone nearly, particularly in the Northern Hemisphere, and we're projecting it backward in time, perhaps unbeknownst to the historians themselves, but it is happening. So we found these, we reached back in time for records of climate, particularly the most accurate one, the most detailed one that we have from an ice core in the Swiss-Italian Alps, the Historical Ice Core Project, which Mike just mentioned, and looked at how atmospheric circulation works. We got inspired, looked at other atmospheric circulations beyond, and and noticed that right around 1000 in Europe, there is a drop in marine air coming from the northeast, which we had actually already published a while ago. This is the prevailing atmospheric circulation northwest to southeast in Europe. And along with that, we saw also an increase in sea level in Europe, but not so much in China. We saw that happen much earlier in China. And the Middle East, completely different story. We see that drop much later. So while this pattern was occurring, it was occurring decades apart in different parts of the world. And so the disagreements that we had been discussing on why people were moving, were reaching beyond their borders, what was, were actually disagreements based on time of occurrence rather than co-occurrence at the same time. And this can be explained when, in one way, by the what's an event that we're noticing right now, actually, changes in the Arctic oscillation, where cold air, penetrates down much farther south than usual. People call it the polar vortex now. It's just the Arctic oscillation, and these changes occur at specific periods when we switch from predominantly cold period to a predominantly warmer period, which is exactly what we were experiencing around the year 1000. And last but not least, of course, this affects these changes affect the environment. That's what I teach, environmental health, and in fact, they changed the disease environment. So, of course, I went back and looked at all the epidemics that I could find in this period, about 600 years, between 720 and 1320. And here they are mapped. I totally agree with Jason. We should complete, this is very difficult to actually show. We're looking at number of epidemic episodes as well as the date. The darker, the later, the greener, the earlier. The white is 1000, and the taller the hexagon, the more. And in fact, this is what we see in the data, particularly about the big chill, so-called in the Middle East, with enormous drought, cold weather, and contrary to the warm period that we experience elsewhere, and an epidemic that immediately followed. So you can see it more graphically here, right around 1000. So that's what we've been working on. And I want to thank the team at the Science of Past, Mike in particular, and also our team at the Climate Change Institute at the University of Maine and Arcadia Fund for funding my postdoc here for the last several years. Thank you.
Sure. Okay. Yes, definitely. It's so great to be back and to speak in a real venue with real people again. And I'm looking forward also to the reception afterward, which hasn't happened for a long time also. I hope there is one. Is there? Good. Okay. So, okay. No, yeah, absolutely. So this work I'm going to be telling you about is a collaboration with Doug Kennett, who's at University of California, Santa Barbara, an archaeologist, with Keith Proofer, an archaeologist at the University of New Mexico, and with Mark Lipson, who's a geneticist from our group, and published just last month or the month before. What's made this type of work possible is the big growth in genome-wide, genome-scale DNA data that's occurred over the last decade, from nothing before 2010 to more than 7,000 individuals with whole genome data of a quality that we can compare people to each other, similar to what we do with personal ancestry testing data. And it makes it possible to address questions that were not made possible to address before. This is a map made by Kendra Serak in our group in an upcoming publication, just of the current distribution of where the data is from. It's very, very asymmetric, with most of the focus being on Europe and Western Eurasia, but it's quite rapidly growing outside of that region now. I'm going to focus on the Maya region in Belize, in Central America, blue boxed there. And for archaeological background, this is the period we're going to be covering, from about 9,600 years ago to 3,700 years ago. And the individuals from which we obtain data are from these groups shown in these probability distributions here. So in groups from a very old period, from 9 to 10,000 years ago, and then some more over here, and then a lot from after 5,700 years ago to 3,700 years ago. And then we compared them to present day Maya speakers from this region, who clearly have a substantial descent from some of these people. Also, here is some archaeological information. The first evidence of maize, manioc, and chili peppers is between 6,000 and 7,000 years, and it begins to be intensively used in this region between 4,600 and 4,000 years ago, with horticulture coming in as an important but not staple way of people living between 5,600 and 4,700 years ago. That's the background. So first maize in Mexico is domesticated at least 9,000 years ago, but apparently the current research for archaeologically and ancient maize research shows that actually the maize that was later grown in Mexico was secondarily improved in South America. And by 6,000 to 5,000 years ago, it becomes a staple crop for the first time, for example, in places like Peru and Bolivia, even before it becomes a staple in Mexico. And then it spreads back up to the Maya region and eventually multiple places in Central America and eventually parts of North America between 5,600 and 4,700 years ago in this particular region. So this is the site of the data that we reported from 23 individuals. This is one of 2 rock shelters in the tropical rainforest area of Belize in Central America. The 2 sites are only a couple of kilometers apart, Mayahak Kapek and Sakitzul. They're in the Bladen Nature Reserve, and they come out of a 2 decades long community archaeology project led by Doug Kennett and Keith Proofer, which has involved yearly return of results to the community in collaboration with community members on producing these results. We ended up producing genome scale data from 23 individuals, ranging from the good quality data comes from 9,600 years ago to 3,700 years ago. The oldest individual, though, is almost 12,000 years ago. The whole story of the data is in this plot, I will show you a little bit about what's going on here. In my lightning talk, I don't have time to tell you more about how this plot is formed, but what this is a principal component analysis. Oops. Each of these dots corresponds to a single individual, a modern individual for the most part, from one set of groups here, one set of groups here, and one set of groups here. These are Chipchin speakers from lower Central America, like places like Panama and Costa Rica. These are people from Central Mexico, and these are another group over here. And so there's 3 groups of samples. The first are the older Belize samples, these purple diamonds. Then there is a shift of the ancestry based on studying hundreds of thousands of positions in the genome. That's highly statistically significant into the 5,600 to 3,700 period toward these Chipchin speakers. And then there's a further significant shift toward northern Mexico. The interpretation that we were able to document was that what must be causing this first shift is gene flow into this Belize region, not from it, from the south, from people related to Chipchin speakers, and that it replaced about 2/3 of the ancestry of this local population through large-scale movement of people from the south mixing into the group that was there before, and that the difference between this group that lasted until 3,700 years ago and Maya today is that there's a further approximately 25% shift in ancestry related to movement from highland Mexico into this region to form groups like the modern Maya. So to sum up, there's evidence from genetics and from language and from archaeology to support a hypothesis. I wanted to just briefly mention the language that's actually also newly reported in this work through a collaboration with David Moran, a linguist who's in the process of a large-scale project to reconstruct loan words, possibly between 2 large groups of language, the Mayans languages and the Chipchin languages, and identified this word, one of the words for maize, which seems to have originated in early Chipchin languages and is very diverse in early Chibcha languages and exists as a simple loan word in one subset of Mayan languages, as would be expected from a borrowing from Chibcha into Mayan languages. So based on multiple of lines of evidence, languages, genes, and archaeology, a possible scenario that could explain this data is that by 5,600 years ago, the time of the first shift that we see in ancestry, Chibcha-speaking Southerners bring maize horticulture technology or economy to the Maya region, and it results in a 2/3 population turnover. And the ancestry shift had already occurred on a large scale by that time, 5,600 years ago, when we have data with the arrival of Southern maize horticulture from South America. But the transition to maize as a staple took a lot longer. So across this region, it's used, but if you look at the isotopes that are in people's teeth, you can tell they're not yet eating maize, which uses a different type of C4 production rather than C3 production. And so you can tell when people are shifting to it. It really had not occurred until the end of this period. And so what you see is movement of people bringing technology, but not yet a staple conversion, quite different from what you see in Europe, where there's a sudden shift in ancestry exactly coincident with the shift in economy. So I wanted to, this is a article that came out along with our paper. I'm not trying to advertise that the press wrote an article about our paper, but this was an article about our paper that came out. And I wanted to extract from it this following quote toward the end of the paper based on two commentators who said, Dr. Lucero and Mr. Roca-Rada said that more data was needed to prove the researchers' hypothesis that a southern migration had brought maize to the Maya region. I absolutely agree. There's more data. It would be wonderful to collect more data if it were possible to from, for example, especially lower Central America. To Dr. Lucera, however, the question is whether researchers should acquire that data. Should we dig up ancestors, she said. Would we want someone to dig up ours to answer interesting yet non-vital research questions? And so I think that's a question in general we should sort of think about. For me, this is an unintellectual question, and I think one that our work is dedicated to, but it's also one that we should consider. Thanks.
So now we'll hear from Professor Margaret Andrews, who's going to offer us some amazing comments, because any comments are amazing because she's doing this spontaneously. This is, as those of us who are teaching or studying in this university know, the time when we've all been busy, crazy with exams and grading papers and so forth. So she's had I've insisted that there be no preparation. So she's going to improvise, and I say, bravo, go Meg.
I have a page. Hi, as Mike said, I'm Meg Andrews, assistant professor in classics. I echo your sentiments, Mike, of how great it is that we're able to have an event like this now, and with such a fitting theme as we crawl out of our caves and return to the light. And what interesting results from pandemic work we heard. A big thank you to our presenters who delivered them. They evince a fascinating array of projects under the aegis of SoHP. I'm mostly a field archaeologist working in Italy, so excavation is my main focus. But as the director of a project, I'm always looking out for new ways of seeing and testing the material. I think what struck me the most today about today's talks is the diversity of disciplines and approaches that SoHP has engendered over the years. A range of scholars that transcends administrative and traditional academic boundaries. We all come from different intellectual directions, but we're all asking similar questions that seek to understand not just what made up the human past, but how we can best go about finding out. Collaboration between archaeologists and archaeoscientists only magnifies the impact of both parties' results and drives forward the very methodological advances that SoHP is so keen to embrace. Indeed, the presentations all had in common at their core a steadfast and determined methodological push forward. Not one limited to whatever the closest field is, but one that draws others in from often far distant fields, and therefore encourages these others to push their own boundaries in turn. It's been refreshing and inspiring to see the results of projects that have embraced that ethos today. So let's ask what we learned from tonight's presenters. I'll start with Dan Smale and Gabe Pizzorno, since collaboration is most explicitly on display there, if no less present in others. As a classical archaeologist, I know well how archaeology and textual studies are often enemies in a fight over reconstructions of and epistemologies of the past. Dan and Gabe's talk is a model for how aspects of the two disciplines can, one, come together fruitfully, something that I hope archaeologists will now appreciate in turn, and two, integrate science and technology into text-based fields in a rather impressive way. I'm hoping that you can code something where I can read all my books that I have to read pretty soon. I see one critical contribution of the project as the digitization of the manuscripts and the resulting ability to disseminate those widely so that others around the world can make easy use of the documentary record of medieval Europe and elsewhere. My favorite aspect was the focus on everyday objects and people that these registers record. This is not traditional in either discipline, but a source of information that often tells us more about the past than elite sources. One question I would ask is, are you thinking about what other types of historical records you could see this being used for beyond medieval registers? I'm thinking more broadly. I'll now turn to Jason Ur and his work integrating data from second-generation intelligence satellites into his landscape archaeological work in the Middle East. Jason's unquestionably a great archaeologist, but it turns out he's also a great armchair archaeologist. He has probably discovered more features in the Middle Eastern landscape than any other archaeologist by cleverly drawing upon satellite imagery of increasing resolution, as we saw at Ur. A true test of Jason's commitment to the history of the area is that he's able to exploit this satellite imagery as the primary means of access to the archaeology of the area amidst such political turmoil. That's very resourceful of you. He's not only able to find features, new features, but also changes in the landscape from earlier satellites or site alterations that are not visible before him. And this importantly actually puts him on the front line of preservation and conservation efforts in the Near East, and thus a mediator for the past and the present to boot. From the historical perspective, and selfishly speaking, I appreciate his work pushing our understanding of time-old questions regarding the earliest cities and their relationship to surrounding landscapes and peoples of it. So Lynn Traudeck brings us back down to the human scale with her work on anomalous burials in early medieval France. I think funerary archaeology can be thought of as a very scaled-down version of landscape archaeology, asking how the bones relate to each other, how the burial relates to a broader spatial context, and what these two configurations tell us about the burial society at large. Anomalous burials give special insight into cultural practices by revealing what was excluded from normal practice or ceremony. And Lynn's work uses fine-grained evidence and a range of scientific approaches to answer why some burials were excluded: sickness, social ostracism, religious violations, etc., to better understand contemporary cultural value systems. Her work is able to touch on a number of disciplines related to issues related to human, environmental, and cultural systems. And it's critical that her work is comparative, because this brings a new source of evidence for information transmission or self-definition between past societies. We zoom out again with Alex Moore's talk on climate change and globalization 1,000 years ago. His talk has about as many large-scale implications for as one could imagine would be possible. He bridges the fields of climate, human environment studies, human disease, ecology. The list could go on. But I think most importantly, he evinces potential in using the past as a window into the present. I'm trying to read my writing here. It has implications for environment and health, especially disease and pandemic, in that he's able to isolate actually that's a question. Are you able to isolate which factors are most impactful on which aspects? I also appreciate trying to not think so globally, right? To isolate historical regions to understand more local climate change. Let's see. Next, we had Michael Isikoff, an intrepid undergraduate who's one of 3 projects dealing with aDNA today. His focus was a wave of migration north into southern Britain and the implications for a sudden change in Celtic languages, for which there's little agreement on date. He comes from an interdisciplinary team, not only across disciplines, but also academic rank, which is important for all of us to be more open-minded about. He brought his strength in statistics, of all things, with ongoing aDNA work to nail down both the date of the northwards migration to the later Bronze Age and a concomitant shift in Celtic language. These are really spectacular results, as it seemed to me at least. The revelation, right, that migrants were as much as 50% of pre-existing population of South Britain, which importantly shows the diversity of early populations in a given region, and therefore their cultural practices. His results bear on issues such as land claims by ancestry and more. The last 2 projects that I'll talk about use aDNA to reveal important aspects of ancient humans' relationship with food. We'll recall David Reich's very important work on the relationship between migration in Central America and the beginning of intensive farming. His importance lies in a number of things. It sheds new light on large-scale human movement and provides evidence of the migration into North America. It shows the diversity of ancestry for an ancient population. It demonstrates that corn came with the migrants and thus reveals the origins of corn as a staple crop among the Maya. He addresses hugely important questions fundamental to global human history and about the role of farming in settling previously itinerant peoples, by extension, the possible origins of any given society. I'm sure you and Michael will have something to say about Ringer and Graeber's Dawn of Everything, since they take on many of these same questions. I also want to ask what's going on with the chili pepper. We'll conclude with Tina Warner's work on the genetics of Tibetan beers and Roman wines. As a Romanist and general fan of alcohol, I found this talk especially interesting. Tina's work brings aDNA and microbiome evidence to residue analysis to better understand practices of fermentation and consumption of certain ancient alcoholic beverages. And I'm assuming this builds off of her extensive work on fermentology. It's so methodologically wide-ranging that it's hard to describe it succinctly. Several points of interest that I found was that the Tibetan material was actually located at a mountain pass, so it has bearing on questions of movement and transmission of foodways, and actually the materials of the foodways. With the reconstructed genomes, I'm wondering if you can see human alterations to those, so the changing in the genetic consistency of these sort of staple crops. I wonder also how people exploited local natural resources. Are they importing this material? Are they trading for it? Or are they actually growing it themselves? So those were some final questions that I had. With that, I'll conclude by thanking the speakers once again and urging all those in attendance to bring to your own work the kind of methodological innovation and active collaborations that SoHP has brought to us today. Thanks.
Thank you. So these are supposed to be lightning talks. We were rather slow lightning in some respects, but I think it's pretty good given that we're out of practice for 2 years. I recognize that I sinned first among all. We'd like to open the floor, therefore, to questions. So I'd ask Alex, and let's see who else is up there. Michael, if you'd come down and sit here so it'd be easier for you to access the microphone if questions are directed toward you. If you're watching us on the internet, welcome again, and please don't hesitate to send your questions via the chat. Claire Adams is standing by and will be sharing those questions with us as we go forward. So, with no further ado, as we get comfy here, the floor is open for questions. I'll start perhaps with some in this room while Claire gathers things that may come in with the chat. Please, Nabil Akhwater. One moment, here comes the micro. It's important to use the microphone because remember, there's a good number of people who are watching us around the globe at this moment.
Thank you, Nabil Al-Kuwaiter. I'm not an academic. I'm an interested visitor, but I am interested in the role of technology and climate change in driving history in the first place. My question is, do you think that we are on the verge of a Copernican revolution in the way that history departments around the world and even political science departments are going to start looking at the way that human societies have evolved and developed, and that you will eventually, you meaning all of you who are applying science to developments in history, whether it's genetics or climate or other measurable quantitative type of work, whether that will maybe turn current historians and political scientists into astrologers.
Astrologers. Dan, do you want to take that? You're a historian. You are also a historian.
Which particular thing would you like me to tackle, Mike? And that brilliant comment.
You mean
Copernicus. Yeah. I mean, I think my first thought is the answer is absolutely yes, and it owes a lot to computers, computational analysis. I mean, I think of David's point about how much more information we have, and that has a lot to do with processing time. I mean, David could say much more about this than I can. I think the really interesting thing that I'm riffing off of that is the fact that one of the real issues is that there's so many narrative structures or frameworks associated with history that has been taught, we've inherited since the 19th and 20th century, that the revolution alone is not enough. We also have to displace the existing narratives, and that's where the battle, the theme of revolution, I think, is very appropriate, because that's where the battle is going to come in. It's not an active or violent battle. It's just a question of displacing existing narratives that are so pervasive.
I think Professor Reich would like to make a comment on that stimulating question.
One thing I've noticed in our field is that when we started doing ancient DNA work, of course, the people we were working with in the prehistoric work we were doing were the most part archaeologists of prehistory. And it took a long time for us to figure out how to talk to archaeologists of prehistory and to talk about, find a language that we could both agree on and that we could write papers together. And it was exciting and difficult and challenging and remains challenging, but I think we've made huge progress collectively working together. Moving into the period of historical research, where we are getting to the time of the written word, where the amount of information available through the written record is so huge, we've begun to work on our first papers in this area, and it's very clear that we're far out of our depth in terms of the type of way we approach the findings and the historians approach the findings, that we're going to need to learn to speak a language that is useful for the historians and figure out whether we can add value in any meaningful way to the discussion. I hope we can, but it's really even a bigger gap between the language we speak and that with archaeologists who are, after all, using and have been using methods of science for a while, such as radiocarbon dating and isotopic analysis and satellite research to look at features and so on. But with historians, it's even a step further, and it's exciting to sort of be part of that discussion.
Great, thank you. Any of other panelists would like to address that? No?
You know, this issue has come up several times. This question of where the field is going, and I love the question that the question is posed at the historians, and it's rarely posed to the scientists. I present at both scientific and historical conferences, and the most fun for me are the scientific conferences, because I keep telling people, scientists, that they're historians, because in most cases on the x-axis they have a timeline, and they just don't know it. And once you actually tell them that they are doing history, they're actually really excited. And so having straddled a couple of fields, it turns out that sometimes taking advantage of that excitement about the past, and as was commented before, what it can tell us about the present and perhaps the future, really works to our advantage in breaking those barriers and those narratives that Professor Smale was highlighting.
We have a question coming in from the internet.
Yeah, so Naya and Fancy would like to ask, I think primarily for Professors Smale and Pizzorno, a question about color classifications using, for instance, the Getty system. So there can be some real differences, as we all know, in the color of a particular object. Take egg yolks, for example. So, I mean, even today, we can see regional differences depending on whether you're using kind of a standard veg-fed egg or a cage-free or organic, pasteurized, et cetera. And so we were wondering, or Nayan was wondering, how do you account for that?
We just have to trust. Okay. Sorry. Ultimately, we're working with data that someone has already generated. So to a point, we have to trust their impression. We have to trust their impression of what color that is. So whether they're measuring it scientifically, as you could do with a colorimeter, or whether it's their perception for, say, the case of a scribe that is just going around the house and taking notes on what's around. We have no way to go past that point. So our goal is just to homogenize the existing information into something we can compare.
Yeah, it's a really extremely interesting question. As Gabe said, with these records, we are dealing with people's perceptions, not with reality. One of the points that Gabe's made in the past is that this is also true for the fact that we rely on museum curators and archaeologists to also code things, and that it is also a form of human perception. So one of the claims that we make is that we're going to operate with the understanding that people in the past do have a degree of knowledge about their world, and that within limits we can rely or trust upon their descriptions. But that's a leap of faith. It's a really interesting leap of faith.
It's a leap of faith, but if I may, as a crude empiricist, suggest that the way you've constructed your categories is encompassing enough that you will have a number of objects that answer to a particular set of descriptions, a range of descriptions, and then it's up to the archaeologists and art historians to pick up the piece that survives and that's to be found in the museums, and perhaps see, in the case in which it's material whose sheen has not, colors have not changed over time, to perhaps be able to verify and to take a step further towards specifying for example, the color perception in question.
One of the things I can add to this is one of the interesting phrases that appears in these inventories are phrases where people will say, it is this or it is this. They'll use the word conjunctions, siwe, seu. These are really interesting moments where they are understanding ambiguity between categories. And this is something that, once we have finished parsing the data set, we can actually explore these areas. What are the domains in which ambiguity is particularly prominent, and actually get at some answers, more specific answers to this question about how fuzzy are the boundaries between blood red and other forms of red, such as ruby red.
Thank you very much. Thank you much. The floor up, please.
So somebody who've done a little bit of machine learning, this is extremely exciting. But I have a question. So I'm very impressed. I heard David speaking several times, and I did not hear you, but you use machine learning. So one of the exciting and dangerous thing in machine learning is what are you looking for, because sometimes you find what you look for. So for example, David is using principal component analysis, a technique that has about 10 names that have been reinvented over 120 years. But it looks for linear surfaces in some multidimensional data, where very often what you look for are curves. Or if you try to partition, you do k-partitions, you look for 4 sets, you'll find 4 categories, you'll look for 12, you'll find 12, you look for 3, you'll find 3 dominant ones. So the labeling in text, or what structure do you look for in your DNA partition, This is not a criticism. This is just extremely challenging, isn't it?
I actually think that's a very interesting question about what contributions techniques like machine learning can make to the types of work that we're doing. I actually think machine learning hasn't been used very much for the core inferences in our field. The inferences and the techniques that we're using for almost collectively for almost all the important claims are explicit model-based inferences, where we have in mind a generative model where we can simulate data under the model, and then we fit data under that model. And so I think that the inferences that we're making about, for example, shifts in the ancestry and the Maya region, for example, in these two different epochs I talked about, or that Michael Isikoff talked about, this shift in ancestry in the late Bronze Age and middle to late Bronze Age, are based on explicit models where the data fits before and after this transition, and we can test statistical significance for alternative scenarios. One of the things that's interesting about genetics is that there's an excellent model. The model is the genome is approximately aligned with a known rate of recombination breaks and mutation, more or less. And simulating under that model, we can produce data that much looks like the genome. And those remain some of the best tools we have. There's just the first bits of applications of some of these very powerful technologies to genetics, and we're beginning to see cases where they outperform, for example, in identifying segments of DNA from other populations, and I'm sure there'll be more of that in the coming years. But we're at a transition where, as the data sets becomes larger, I think that those approaches will begin to bear fruit.
Thank you. I have a question for Alexander. I noticed in the plot where you show the dry periods in Europe, they were preceded by several decades by extremely wet periods. Is that something you observe more often, or is it just a coincidence?
In general, there is variability, and particularly this is the data set that I was showing is for Europe, the Old World Drought Atlas based on tree rings, published by Edward Cook of Lamont Doherty at Columbia University. And the variability is significant, and it becomes more significant, of course, the smaller the area you choose. And that's kind of the point of the whole paper that Professor Hansen and I were writing, that yes, it's important to look at global patterns, but also, the local patterns are going to give you a much better insight into why a certain band of Vikings or certain population of China moved south, or band of Vikings crossed to Greenland. So yes, absolutely, and it's not simply I only had 5 minutes, so I focused on drought, but it's not only precipitation drought; it's also temperature, is dust, what dust does to fields, which is part of our work with Mike and our colleagues from the Climate Change Institute to forthcoming, and or lack thereof, and therefore famines and what does. In general, I think, it's important to think about these transition periods because we're experiencing one, and what that type of extreme transition can bring about in terms of changes in the environment, and therefore the disease environment, and therefore what people are doing. And that's where David and everyone else picks up with migrations and mapping them. I'm a little bit farther into the future, but eventually we'll meet somewhere.
Please. Ma'am. No, we have another question. Mask lady. Susanna.
Yeah, thank you. I was really interested by something you said, David, and also how that relates to Michael's paper. And my interest is really in the old pots and people question. And so, you know, when do we have enough data to actually correlate population change and change in technology, in culture? And you would kind of assume if a population brought a new language, as in your Celtic question, then that change would be immediate. But then we also have examples of change taking decades, centuries to take hold, and we have change, we think, where no population ever really, where there were no great population movements. And so I'm just interested on how things are developing in the field and what what's kind of are the trends in recent research in this area, because yeah, I mean, I grew up with, oh, beware, you know, that you find a new kind of pot doesn't mean that there is a new kind of person. So how do we see this now?
Great. Pots versus people is a great debate. I think David probably would like to say something about it. I certainly would like to say something about it also. And with respect to language, so the Max Planck Harvard Research Center, one of our groups led by Cosimo Post out of Jena, Leipzig, and now Tübingen, has shown has resolved a debate that has been going on since Herodotus about the origins of the mysterious people, the Etruscans. Herodotus claimed that they came from Anatolia, from Asia Minor, and that's why they spoke this weird language and were completely different from everyone else. And archaeologists have connected that with the so-called Orientalizing phase, the development of this beautiful, incredible art in the first millennium BC. Someone from the same place as Herodotus, Dionysius of Halicarnassus, offered a completely different explanation that nope, they were just completely local and they had this weird language. So this has been a real debate. Are the Etruscans, emigres from far away? Why do they speak a language that is unrelated to any known language on Earth? And now the genetic evidence shows quite clearly that from 900, at least from 900 BCE onward, that the people in this part of central Italy that we archaeologically identify as Etruscans are genetically pretty much the same as everybody else in the Italian peninsula. That is to say, they're a mixture of the locally attested genetic population, genetically analyzed, understood populations, and strikingly of something from the steppe, of a descendant of the Great Migration that David's group identified in 2015 as the genetic marker of the spread of the Indo-European languages into Western Eurasia. And they would later show moved east as well from genetic evidence. So here we have a very unusual case where we have a genetic signature which looks like everyone else, basically analogous to everyone else in Italy, but they didn't, and they got the genetic input from the newcomers from the north, from the steppe, through perhaps the intermediary stages, who spoke the Indo-European languages. But this people did not adapt the new language. Everybody else in Italy accepted Indo-European and began to speak various dialects of Oscan and what have you, Umbrian, etc. Not the Etruscans. So this genetic discovery completely complicates our understanding and obliges us now to go back to the archaeology, to the few texts that we have in Etruscan, to the art history even, and try to ask ourselves, so what was special about the Etruscan civilization at that time when the admixture happened, that unlike everyone else in Italy, they did not adapt the new language? And that's going to open up a whole set of wonderful new questions. So we may have answered one question, but opened up a whole series of others, and on a new and very, very solid basis. David, you may wish to have some comments on this, as may others as well.
Just a simple thing, which is that, I think the genetics in theory converts that from a theoretical question to an empirical question, because with the genetic data, you can answer the question about whether the people changed from time A to time B in a particular place. And you can look at the archaeological evidence and see if it there's a transition there, and you could just ask. And so I think that one of the things that's been exciting for people in the last 8 years, since it's become possible to do this, is to just look in multiple different archaeological transitions and look at genetic data before and after and during that transition, and just see how often it is accompanied by change and how often not. Sometimes there's very, very dramatic change in multiple examples, and other times there's no evidence for very strong change, such as in the example that Mike mentioned. So it's interesting and very exciting to be able to measure this. So that's the main thing.
So we are very much in a new time with new data, which is producing new answers, which in turn are producing amazing new questions. And these are what you've heard in the past hour plus are things that have been discovered in the last 24, 36, whatever it is, months of pandemic that we've all been going through. I think it's time to put an end to this part of our engagement and move to a reception where I will invite you to look at the posters produced by a future generation of archaeoscientists, of scientists of the human past, that were produced in connection with our undergraduate course in the fall, and to enjoy some light refreshments and continue the conversation with our speakers and among ourselves. But let us thank all the panelists and our commentator for their wonderful presentations today.